The heavy crystal chandeliers of the grand palace shattered the light into 1,000 mocking pieces as Alpha King Garrick sneered down from his iron throne. He looked at his quiet Omega wife with absolute unadulterated disgust, her simple gray dress a pathetic contrast to the glittering jewels of the court. Garrick declared that he officially rejected their sacred mating bond, throwing her away before the entire nobility. His thunderous voice echoed off the high stone walls as he called her a boring, unobservant creature completely unfit to wear his royal crown or stand in his powerful shadow. The cruel aristocrats laughed loudly, their sharp whispers slicing deeper than any physical blade. Briony stood entirely frozen at the center of the polished marble floor, her head bowed in absolute forced submission. She absorbed the suffocating humiliation silently, her face a perfect mask of blank compliance. The court saw only a pathetic, worthless servant girl who could not even read the mood of a room. They had absolutely no idea that her sharp eyes had spotted a lethal dose of nightshade in the king wine chalice just moments before the feast began. With a single silent gesture, she had subtly switched his cup, saving his arrogant life while he prepared to destroy her dignity. She did not shed a single tear as she turned her back on the laughing throne room, walking away into the cold winter night with a fierce burning knowledge that she was the only reason he was still breathing. The heavy iron doors shut behind her, sealing her departure and marking the absolute end of her silent loyalty to a blind king. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. The dawn broke over the towering iron spires of the massive castle, casting long freezing shadows across the heavy stone courtyard. To live as an Omega in the grand royal fortress was to be completely, utterly invisible. Briony sat alone in the damp, drafty corner of the main bustling corridor, her small, delicate frame swallowed entirely by a plain, coarse woolen shawl. She was completely ignored by the rushing, busy servants and the arrogant, high-born nobles who paraded past her in their fine morning clothes. They wore heavy, rich silk and glittering gold, laughing loudly as they discussed the cruel public rejection that had occurred the night before in the Great Hall. To them, she was nothing more than a pathetic ghost, a dull, unobservant creature who had foolishly failed to entertain her powerful Alpha King. They openly mocked her boring demeanor, deliberately spilling hot drops of bitter morning tea dangerously close to her bare feet just to watch her flinch in fear. But Briony did not weep, and she did not react with sudden anger. She simply lowered her head, further allowing her dark, unkempt hair to fall forward, acting the perfect, pathetic part of a fragile, broken servant. She knew with absolute, terrifying clarity that her invisibility was her absolute greatest impenetrable armor. While the loud, arrogant alpha warriors practiced aggressively swinging heavy steel broadswords in the muddy training courtyard, relying entirely on brute physical force, Briony fought a much more dangerous, completely silent war. She held a small wooden embroidery hoop in her calloused hands, her long, sharp needle piercing the tight white linen with a rhythmic, mesmerizing precision. To a casual passing glance, she was merely stitching a chaotic, ugly pattern of wild, tangled flowers, a tragic, disappointing display of her dull, unrefined mind. But beneath the seemingly random, messy tangle of colorful threads lay a brilliantly complex, coded map of the entire massive kingdom. Every single tiny stitch was a highly classified piece of carefully gathered intelligence. The bright crimson thread looping around the frayed edge represented the treacherous northern border lords who were secretly gathering illicit iron weapons. The thin, delicate golden silk forming the center blossom tracked the massive hidden flow of heavily bribed gold moving silently between the royal treasurer and the corrupt eastern mercenaries. And the dark, heavy black thread, weaving silently through the entire background, tracked the active, deadly assassination plots directly targeting King Garrick. She possessed a flawless eidetic memory, capturing every single hushed whisper in the dark hallways, every nervous darting glance exchanged between rival dukes, and every sudden unusual shift in the daily castle guard routines. She gathered these fragmented, scattered pieces of silent treason and wove them perfectly into her brilliant, ever-expanding web of absolute control. A harsh, imposing shadow suddenly fell over her small wooden frame. Lady Seraphina, a high-born noblewoman, completely dripping in heavy, expensive diamonds and lush winter furs, stopped to sneer down at the quiet Omega. Seraphina laughed, a cold, piercing sound completely devoid of any genuine warmth, loudly mocking the chaotic, messy stitching resting in Briony hands. Seraphina loudly declared to her trailing handmaidens that it was an absolute stunning miracle. The king had not violently banished Briony to the freezing outer villages. Years ago, considering her tragic, embarrassing lack of simple domestic skill and her suffocating, incredibly boring presence. Briony immediately ducked her chin, her voice trembling perfectly as she offered a quiet, pathetic apology to the cruel lady. She made herself appear incredibly small, completely masking the fierce, terrifying intelligence burning brightly behind her amber eyes. She knew exactly what Serafina was doing behind closed doors. She knew that the arrogant lady was currently heavily indebted to the dangerous southern smuggling rings and was actively secretly selling the castle guard patrol schedules to pay off her massive hidden debts. Briony could have destroyed Serafina entirely with a single whispered word to the High Court executioner, but she patiently held her tongue, letting the foolish, vain woman continue to falsely believe she was vastly superior. True, unyielding power did not need to shout loudly to be heard. True power quietly held the sharp, poisoned blade in the absolute dark, waiting for the perfect, calculated moment to strike. As Serafina walked away completely satisfied with her petty, cruel victory, Briony returned her profound focus entirely to her intricate needlework. Her brilliant mind worked vastly faster than any highly decorated royal scholar, rapidly decoding a freshly intercepted raven scroll she had completely memorized just moments before the loud morning bell. The highly encoded message had been hidden brilliantly inside a seemingly mundane list of winter grain supplies delivered to the outer scullery kitchens. Most ordinary people would see absolutely nothing but a boring ledger of wheat and barley, but Briony instantly recognized the shifting complex numerical cipher completely unique to the violent Western rebel factions. Her needle moved with a sudden frantic hidden urgency, pulling a thick, heavy black thread tightly through the white linen fabric. The great Alpha King had completely publicly rejected her, discarding her as a worthless, boring burden, but the inescapable bitter irony was that she was the only functional invisible shield standing directly between his heavy, arrogant crown and absolute bloody ruin. Without her silent daily interventions, his grand golden throne would have been violently overthrown months ago. She finished tying a complex hidden knot at the very bottom of the linen fabric, her breath suddenly catching sharply in her dry throat. The final decrypted sequence from the intercepted grain ledger formed a terrifying crystal-clear picture in her brilliant. This was not a vague distant threat originating from a foreign border. It was an incredibly precise immediate internal strike located right inside the castle walls. She stared deeply at the small black knot, completely realizing the horrifying, staggering magnitude of the new plot. The hidden traitors had successfully breached the inner royal perimeter, completely bypassing Garrick's heavy muscular alpha guards without raising a single alarm. The king had loudly, arrogantly declared he absolutely did not need her silent, boring presence, but a massive, chilling cliffhanger hung heavily in the freezing, drafty air as Briony realized the deadliest strike was scheduled to happen before the very next sunset. The massive, violent ambush was perfectly targeting the exact royal hunting path. The king was arrogantly preparing to ride, completely unaware that his trusted inner circle was deeply, violently compromised, and his only The midnight bell chimed a hollow, echoing note across the sleeping castle, signaling the exact moment Briony completely shed her pathetic daytime disguise. The heavy, oppressive silence of the night was not a source of fear for her. It was an absolute liberating embrace. She threw off the coarse, itchy woolen shawl she wore to make herself appear small and fragile, replacing it with a sleek, dark velvet cloak that allowed her to blend perfectly into the absolute blackness of the heavy stone corridors. She moved with terrifying, flawless grace, her bare feet making absolutely no sound against the freezing stone floor as she navigated the labyrinthine hallways. She easily bypassed the heavy armored guards who were busy drinking cheap ale and complaining about the bitter winter cold, completely blind to the brilliant phantom slipping right past their thick iron spears. She approached a massive ancient tapestry, depicting a long-forgotten bloody battle, pushing aside the heavy, dusty fabric to reveal a crumbling, narrow stone archway. This was the hidden entrance to the deep subterranean catacombs, a sprawling, forgotten network of damp tunnels, completely omitted from the official royal blueprints. To the arrogant Alpha King and his clumsy soldiers, these tunnels were nothing but dead ends and collapsed tombs. To Briony, they were the pulsing nervous system of her vast, undeniable. She descended the steep, winding stone stairs, the air growing incredibly thick with the sharp scent of damp earth and burning tallow. At the very bottom of the massive, spiraling descent lay a cavernous, circular chamber, completely illuminated by dozens of flickering candles reflecting off polished obsidian walls. This was her shadow court, the absolute center of her vast intelligence network. 4 cloaked figures stood waiting in the dim golden light, her most trusted whisperers. They were not high-born nobles or heavily armored warriors. They were scullery maids, crippled stable boys, and forgotten street urchins, the absolute lowest outcasts of the rigid alpha society who possessed the uncanny, brilliant ability to move through the world completely unnoticed. As Briony stepped fully into the warm, glowing light, the 4 figures immediately bowed their heads, not out of terrifying physical fear, but out of profound, staggering reverence for her unparalleled intellect. She did not command them with a heavy iron sword. She earned their absolute loyalty by protecting them from the cruel, violent whims of the aristocracy. She knew exactly how to treat them, providing them with warm food and safe shelter, in exchange for the most valuable currency in the entire world, which was pure information. These invisible people were her true family, completely replacing the cold, arrogant royal court that had always treated her like worthless dirt. They loved her fiercely, completely recognizing the magnificent, powerful sovereign hiding beneath her plain, dull clothes. A young boy with a heavily scarred face stepped forward, extending a small, trembling hand to offer a tightly rolled piece of parchment sealed with dark green wax. He whispered that a suspicious raven had landed near the Western Armory, completely avoiding the official royal rookery. Briony took the tiny scroll, her sharp amber eyes immediately analyzing the heavy green seal. It bore absolutely no official crest, but the slight jagged imperfection on the right edge was an unmistakable signature of the corrupt Western border lords. She broke the brittle wax, smoothing the tiny parchment flat against a heavy wooden table. The message appeared to be a completely mundane list of hunting hounds and winter saddles, but Briony's brilliant mind instantly stripped away the useless, superficial words. She applied a complex cascading numerical shift cipher, translating the hidden meaning in a matter of breathless seconds. Her pulse remained perfectly steady as the true dark message revealed itself. The corrupt Western lords were completely coordinating a massive second assassination plot designed to violently ambush the king during his heavily guarded journey to the Winter Solstice Festival. They had secretly bribed the outer gatekeepers to leave the heavy iron portcullis unlocked, allowing a heavily armed mercenary strike force to flood the inner courtyard before the royal vanguard could even draw their swords. Briony looked up from the decoded parchment, her face an impenetrable mask of cold, calculating authority. She turned to her oldest whisperer, a tall, slender woman wearing a tattered gray cloak, and issued a series of rapid, incredibly precise commands. She did not order a loud, violent confrontation. Briony commanded her network to quietly poison the specific barrels of ale destined for the corrupt gatekeepers, using a mild sleeping draft that would completely neutralize them before the midnight shift. Furthermore, she ordered her shadows to subtly alter the royal travel manifests, redirecting the mercenary strike force directly into a heavily fortified dead-end gorge located miles away from the true festival route. It was a masterpiece of silent psychological warfare, completely dismantling a massive bloody rebellion without spilling a single drop of blood or raising a single terrifying alarm. The whisperers nodded in absolute perfect synchronization, scattering instantly into the dark tunnels to execute her brilliant, flawless design. As the chamber emptied, Briony stood alone in the flickering candlelight, resting her calloused hands on the heavy wooden table. She had just saved the great Alpha King Arrogant life for the second time in a single day, completely unseen and entirely unthanked. A deep, profound ache settled heavily into her chest as she remembered the absolute brutal humiliation of his public rejection. He had proudly, loudly declared her a boring, unobservant creature, while completely depending on her vast hidden genius to keep his heavy golden crown firmly on his head. Her immense intellect was a terrifying, roaring fire, but she was constantly violently forced to smother it to survive in his shallow, brutal world. She had spent her entire marriage absorbing his cruel insults and watching him blindly praise his loud, incompetent generals. She had woven a massive, invisible shield around his entire kingdom, entirely out of her own quiet sense of duty. But duty suddenly felt incredibly hollow. The deep, agonizing pain of his cruel words was slowly, rapidly transforming into a fierce, unstoppable clarity. She was vastly superior to the clumsy, arrogant men who ruled the daylight. She controlled the absolute truth, yet a massive, heavy cliffhanger completely shattered her quiet contemplation as her sharp eyes caught sight of a second hidden scroll tucked beneath the first one, confirming the horrifying details of the third imminent assassination plot, the hunting path ambush she had deduced earlier. She realized with terrifying absolute certainty that she could easily stop this third attack too. But a sudden, radical, empowering question echoed fiercely in her brilliant mind, asking why she should continue to bleed in the dark to protect a cruel king who so violently despised her light. The faint, brittle scent of the old parchment lingering in the flickering candlelight violently transported Briony back through the dark corridors of her memory. It was the sharp, terrifying smell of burning paper and cold ash, a scent she had spent 10 agonizing years desperately trying to forget. She closed her striking amber eyes, leaning heavily against the rough stone wall of the subterranean chamber, as the heavy shadows violently shifted, pulling her directly into the most traumatic night of her entire life. She was only a small, terrified child, shivering violently in the freezing courtyard of the old capital, watching the massive roaring flames of an execution pyre paint the midnight sky a horrifying shade of violent orange. Tied securely to the heavy wooden post at the center of the blinding inferno was her father, a gentle, brilliant Omega scholar who possessed a mind far more powerful than any conquering army. Her father had been the secret tactical architect of the previous Alpha King, helping the massive kingdom win countless bloody wars through his unparalleled intelligence and flawless diplomatic strategies. But his absolute fatal mistake was completely forgetting the fragile, toxic nature of extreme alpha pride. During a grand public war council, her father had brilliantly successfully outsmarted the old king, exposing a massive, fatal flaw in the royal defense strategy that would have led thousands of innocent soldiers to a senseless, bloody slaughter. He had spoken the absolute truth, expecting gratitude for saving the massive empire. Instead, the old king, completely humiliated and violently threatened by the undeniable superior intellect of a lowly Omega, had immediately accused him of dark treason. The old regime did not reward brilliant Omegas. They violently, brutally eradicated them to protect their archaic hierarchy. Briony remembered the heavy, suffocating smoke stinging her wide, terrified eyes as she stood completely paralyzed in the freezing snow. Through the roaring, chaotic flames, her father had locked his calm, gentle eyes entirely on her, his voice echoing powerfully in her young, brilliant mind over the deafening roar of the fire. He had whispered a fierce, desperate command that became the absolute defining law of her entire existence. He told her to hide her magnificent fire, because in a brutal world ruled entirely by arrogant wolves, the smartest lamb must always wear the dullest fleece to survive. He commanded her to be completely invisible to let them believe she was entirely stupid and worthless, because a genius Omega, standing in the bright light, was nothing but a rapid, inevitable death sentence. She had absorbed his agonizing final lesson with absolute perfect clarity, completely burying her magnificent, terrifying intellect deep within her broken soul. From that horrifying night forward, she had flawlessly played the pathetic part of a fragile, useless creature. She deliberately stumbled over complex words, she intentionally ruined simple embroidery, and she completely masked her razor-sharp intuition behind a veil of incredibly boring, empty stares. When Alpha King Garrick had proudly chosen her as his silent, obedient mate, completely expecting a dull, ornamental wife, she had seamlessly continued the brilliant, lifelong performance. She had willingly accepted his cruel daily insults and his suffocating arrogance, completely convinced that staying hidden in the dark was the only possible way to honor her father and protect her own fragile, beating heart. But as Briony slowly opened her amber eyes, the traumatic, burning memory, fading back into the damp reality of the glowing subterranean chamber, a profound, massive shift violently shattered her long-held convictions. She looked down at the newly decoded parchment, revealing the third imminent deadly ambush scheduled for the royal hunting path. She had spent her entire miserable marriage bleeding silently in the dark to protect a man who possessed the exact same toxic, arrogant pride that had brutally murdered her brilliant father. Garrick had publicly, humiliatingly discarded her before the entire glittering court, completely severing the sacred mating bond because he despised the very dull fleece she wore to keep him safe. He wanted a flashy, beautiful queen, completely blind to the fact that her boring, invisible presence was the only absolute force, keeping the terrifying daggers completely away from his heavy spine. A fierce, roaring heat began to rapidly spread through her veins, completely burning away the thick layers of deeply ingrained childhood trauma. She was no longer a terrified little girl crying in the freezing snow. She was a magnificent, terrifying sovereign of the shadows, holding the absolute fate of the massive northern empire entirely in the palm of her calloused hands. She slowly picked up the dark parchment containing the third assassination plot, her sharp mind calculating the exact, precise timeline of the impending brutal attack. She could easily dispatch her loyal whisperers to silently neutralize the hidden mercenaries, just as she had flawlessly done 1,000 times before. But a magnificent, terrifying cliffhanger hung heavily in the damp, echoing air. As Briony slowly lowered the parchment, her amber eyes blazing with an incredible, fierce new light, entirely deciding that she would absolutely not stop the hunting path ambush, because the great Alpha King desperately needed to learn exactly what happens when his boring, invisible shield permanently stops blocking the deadly incoming sword. The bitter, freezing wind whipped fiercely across the high, snowy ridge overlooking the royal hunting path. Briony stood completely hidden behind a massive, ancient pine tree, wearing a heavy white velvet cloak that blended flawlessly into the blinding winter landscape. She had come to the high ridge with the absolute fierce intention of watching the great Alpha King fall. She wanted him to finally face the brutal, deadly consequences of his staggering arrogance and completely experience the terrifying vulnerability of a world without her invisible shield. Below her, in the deep, narrow gorge, King Garrick rode proudly on his massive black warhorse, completely surrounded by his heavy armored vanguard. They laughed loudly and boasted about their incredible physical strength, entirely blind to the deadly, silent shadows moving swiftly through the dense, frozen trees just a few yards above them. Briony's sharp amber eyes easily tracked the hidden mercenary assassins, watching as their lead sniper slowly raised a heavy steel crossbow, aiming the deadly poison bolt directly at the unprotected gap in the king's thick silver armor. This was the exact historical moment. She simply had to stand perfectly still, and the arrogant man who had publicly, brutally humiliated her would be completely erased from the world. Her brilliant mind coldly calculated the exact trajectory of the bolt, knowing it would completely pierce his massive heart before his clumsy guards could even draw their swords. But as the mercenary fingers slowly tightened on the heavy iron trigger, a sudden profound realization violently shattered her dark desire for bloody vengeance. Letting him die would only prove that he was physically weak, but it would absolutely not prove her magnificent immense worth. If he perished in the cold snow, he would never truly understand the staggering magnitude of the brilliant gift he had foolishly thrown away. He needed to live to watch his grand impenetrable fortress completely crumble into dust without her. Driven by a fierce empowering clarity, Briony swiftly drew a tiny weighted silver throwing knife from her hidden leather belt. With breathtaking, terrifying precision, she whipped her small arm forward, sending the silver blade flying silently through the freezing air. The sharp metal violently severed the thick tension string of the heavy crossbow mere milliseconds before it fired. The sudden loud mechanical snap of the breaking weapon violently shattered the quiet winter morning, completely exposing the hidden assassins. The heavy crossbow bolt dropped harmlessly into the deep snow, entirely missing the Alpha King. The loud, unexpected noise instantly alerted the royal vanguard, who frantically drew their heavy broadswords and charged aggressively up the steep, snowy embankment. The disarmed, panicked mercenaries were quickly brutally slaughtered by the overwhelming brute physical force of the heavily armed royal guards. Briony watched from the high untouched ridge as the chaotic, bloody skirmish quickly ended. King Garrick, completely unharmed, sat tall on his massive warhorse, radiating a fierce, arrogant pride. His booming voice echoed loudly through the freezing gorge as he enthusiastically praised his heavy infantry, loudly commending his dense captain for his supposedly brilliant vigilance and unmatched tactical awareness. He looked down at the dead assassins and proudly declared that absolutely no enemy could ever outsmart the raw physical might of the northern military, entirely blind to the tiny silver throwing knife buried deeply in the bloody snow just a few feet away. A profound heavy heartache briefly squeezed Briony's chest as she watched him loudly celebrate his completely false victory. He was so incredibly deeply blind, completely intoxicated by the loud superficial display of heavy steel and brute muscle. He truly believed his massive, arrogant soldiers had saved him, completely unaware that the boring, worthless Omega he had publicly discarded had just magically spared his life from the silent shadows. But the painful, lingering ache of his public rejection was rapidly replaced by a magnificent, surging tidal wave of absolute pure empowerment. She had successfully proven to herself that she held the absolute power of life and death over the greatest Alpha King in the realm. She did not need his toxic validation or his heavy golden crown to confirm her breathtaking, immense worth. She was the absolute, undisputed master of the shadows, and she was finally permanently done bleeding for a man who violently despised her quiet light. Briony turned her back on the noisy, arrogant celebration below, moving silently, rapidly back toward the towering fortress before the royal hunting party could return. She slipped flawlessly past the heavy outer guards and navigated the complex hidden servant corridors, completely unnoticed for the very last time. She entered the massive empty royal bedchamber where the king slept, a room she had intimately aggressively protected from countless dark threats for their entire miserable marriage. The grand room smelled heavily of expensive cedar and alpha pride, completely devoid of any real warmth or genuine love. She walked slowly, deliberately toward the massive four-poster bed, stopping directly beside his heavy velvet sleeping pillow. She reached beneath the collar of her plain gray dress, pulling out a heavy, intricate silver insignia suspended on a thin, strong chain. It was a beautiful, terrifying crest of a silent shadow wolf, the absolute ultimate symbol of the supreme royal spymaster, a highly classified title she had secretly, flawlessly held for years. She slowly pulled the heavy silver chain over her head, feeling a profound physical, emotional release as the cold metal left her skin. She placed the heavy silver insignia perfectly in the exact center of his dark velvet pillow, leaving absolutely no written note and no desperate emotional explanation. The brilliant, silent mastermind did not need to leave a messy trail of angry words. The heavy, abandoned silver crest was the ultimate devastating statement of her absolute, permanent resignation. She turned gracefully away from the massive royal bed, her striking amber eyes blazing with an incredible, fierce new destiny. She wrapped her dark velvet cloak tightly around her small, delicate shoulders and walked confidently out of the grand bedchamber, completely abandoning her toxic past. She slipped out through the ancient secret catacombs, vanishing flawlessly into the howling, harsh winter night without leaving a single footprint in the deep snow. A massive, terrifying cliffhanger suddenly hung in the freezing dark air because as the invisible shield officially permanently left the massive royal fortress, the heavy iron portcullis violently groaned and the deeply compromised castle walls were instantly left completely, utterly exposed to a massive, hidden fourth assassination plot that the arrogant Alpha King would absolutely never see coming. The massive iron portcullis of the grand fortress groaned loudly as King Garrick rode his black warhorse into the main courtyard, expecting the usual highly organized display of absolute military perfection. Instead, a sudden, incredibly terrifying chaos. Without the silent, invisible hand of the master spy constantly adjusting the complex guard rotations and intercepting the deadly poisoned ravens, the supposedly impenetrable royal security network instantly began to completely collapse. The courtyard was a chaotic mess of confused heavy infantry and panicked shouting lords. A terrified royal messenger violently pushed his way through the massive crowd, falling heavily to his knees directly before the king. The messenger frantically reported that the vital eastern border alliances had completely unexpectedly crumbled overnight. The corrupt eastern mercenaries had successfully received their massive hidden bribes of gold, bypassing the usually flawless royal intelligence blockade. Garrick's massive chest heaved with sudden roaring fury, his icy blue eyes scanning the disorganized courtyard with terrifying disbelief. He was the greatest alpha warrior in the known world, completely relying on his heavy steel armies, but suddenly his physical strength felt incredibly useless against this invisible creeping treason. Garrick aggressively dismounted his tall horse, his heavy armored boots slamming against the freezing cobblestones. He loudly demanded to know why his highly decorated intelligence officers had completely failed to anticipate the Eastern betrayal. The arrogant generals could only stammer pathetic, weak excuses, completely unaware that their legendary unseen spymaster had permanently abandoned her post. Furious and completely disgusted by their incompetence, Garrick stormed through the heavy oak doors of the Grand Hall, marching directly toward his private royal chambers. He completely trusted his inner perimeter guards, entirely blind to the terrifying fact that the corrupt gatekeepers had easily allowed a deadly shadow assassin to slip directly into the inner sanctum during the chaotic shift change. As Garrick angrily pushed past a heavy velvet tapestry leading to his private corridor, a sudden violent blur of dark motion erupted from the deep shadows. A highly trained assassin armed with a curved poisoned dagger lunged directly at his unprotected throat. Garrick's raw alpha reflexes violently flared. He roared, dodging the deadly strike by a mere fraction of an inch, and swung his heavy armored forearm, violently smashing the assassin into the hard stone wall. The chaotic, brutal physical struggle lasted only a few bloody seconds before Garrick managed to completely snap the assassin's neck with his bare, massive hands. As the dead mercenary slumped to the cold floor, Garrick looked down at his own silver armor, completely horrified to see a long, jagged scratch across his heavy steel breastplate. The deadly poison blade had come incredibly close to ending his magnificent reign right inside his own supposedly fortified home. He stood completely frozen, his massive chest heaving violently as a profound, terrifying realization began to crack his immense arrogant pride. For his entire victorious reign, he had arrogantly believed that his heavy broadswords and intimidating muscle were the only things keeping him safe. But this terrifying breach proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that he had been blindly protected by a magnificent, invisible force that was suddenly terrifyingly absent. He left the dead assassin bleeding on the stone floor, ignoring the frantic shouts of his rushing guards, and slowly pushed open the heavy wooden doors of his private royal bedchamber. The grand room was completely silent, feeling incredibly empty and unnervingly cold. He walked heavily toward his massive four-poster bed, his powerful muscles aching terribly from the sudden adrenaline and the crushing weight of his failing kingdom. He looked down at the dark velvet pillows, fully expecting to find absolutely nothing but empty silk. Instead, his icy blue eyes completely widened in absolute terrifying shock. Resting perfectly in the exact center of his sleeping pillow, completely illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the high glass window, was a heavy, intricate silver insignia. It was the breathtaking crest of the silent shadow wolf. Garrick's massive heart completely stopped beating in his broad chest. He recognized the heavy silver crest instantly. It was the highly classified sacred seal of his legendary supreme spymaster, the brilliant phantom who had silently, flawlessly guided his military campaigns and eradicated his political enemies for years. He had never seen the spymaster face communicating with the absolute genius entirely through highly encrypted anonymous raven scrolls. He had constantly loudly praised the Shadow Master, holding immense respect for the brilliant mind that secured his heavy golden crown. But the Shadow Master had never entered his private bedchamber. He slowly reached out with a violently trembling hand, picking up the heavy, cold silver metal. His sharp alpha senses suddenly flared, catching the very faint, lingering scent attached to the heavy silver chain. It was the delicate, soft scent of wild lavender and damp winter earth, the exact, undeniable scent of his quiet, boring Omega wife. You're listening to this story on the Alpha King Secrets channel. Are you enjoying today's story? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Now, let's get back to the story. The incredibly massive, horrifying truth crashed over the great alpha warrior like a violently collapsing mountain of solid iron. the brilliant legendary Shadow Master he deeply revered, and the pathetic worthless servant girl he had publicly brutally humiliated were the exact same magnificent. Briony was the supreme spy master. She was the invisible shield. She was the unparalleled genius who had flawlessly protected his arrogant life while he cruelly loudly called her stupid and unobservant in front of the entire laughing court. A profound, agonizing wave of pure devastating regret violently ripped through his dark soul, completely shattering his toxic arrogant pride into a million irreparable pieces. He had publicly thrown away the most valuable, magnificent mind in the known world simply because she did not wear flashy silk or speak loudly in the grand halls. He collapsed heavily onto the edge of the massive bed, his broad, muscular shoulders trembling violently under the crushing, agonizing weight of his monumental, catastrophic mistake. He had brutally severed their sacred mating bond, completely blind to the spectacular, beautiful fire, hiding quietly beneath her plain gray dress. He desperately clutched the heavy silver insignia tightly against his wildly beating heart, a completely broken, arrogant king, finally mourning the magnificent queen he never deserved. Without her brilliant, terrifying intellect, his grand fortress was absolutely nothing but a fragile, hollow tomb waiting to be violently swallowed by the dark treachery of the court. But a sudden, massive, terrifying cliffhanger violently gripped his panicked mind as the severed mating bond roared to life in his rushing blood, screaming with a fierce, agonizing demand, because he completely realized that hunting down the most dangerous, brilliant spy master in the entire world would be absolutely impossible without walking directly into the deadly, terrifying shadows she flawlessly controlled. The freezing winter wind howled violently through the towering skeletal trees of the deep northern woods, tearing at King Garrick's heavy velvet cloak as he rode desperately into the unforgiving dark. He had abandoned his crumbling, chaotic fortress, leaving his panicked generals to blindly defend the high stone walls. The grand iron throne and the heavy golden crown meant absolutely nothing to him now. His massive chest heaved with a profound, agonizing desperation that completely overshadowed the biting cold. He was no longer hunting as a proud, arrogant conqueror, but as a completely broken, humbled man searching for the magnificent soul he had foolishly thrown. The heavy silver insignia of the Shadow Wolf was pressed tightly against his wildly beating heart beneath his thick steel armor, acting as his only fragile tether to the brilliant woman who had silently kept him alive for years. He rode completely alone, refusing to bring his clumsy royal vanguard, because he knew perfectly well that brute military force would never find the greatest spy master in the known world. He had to enter the terrifying invisible shadows entirely on her terms. Without Briony's brilliant tactical foresight constantly guiding his path, the vast ancient force felt incredibly hostile and completely foreign. For his entire victorious reign, she had flawlessly mapped the safe hidden routes, eradicating the deadly traps, long before his heavy warhorse ever reached the tree line. He had arrogantly believed that his raw physical muscle was the supreme ultimate power, entirely ignorant to the spectacular invisible shield she had maintained around his oblivious life. Now every snapping dry branch and shifting shadow felt like a terrifying imminent threat, mocking his absolute staggering vulnerability. His icy blue eyes strained desperately against the pitch-black night, realizing that his heavy broadsword was entirely useless against an enemy he could not even see. The agonizing, crushing guilt of his cruel public rejection burned fiercely in his dark soul, completely paralyzing his legendary alpha confidence. He had loudly called her boring and unobservant while failing to observe the magnificent, fierce genius, keeping his arrogant kingdom from violently collapsing into bloody ash. A sudden, loud, sharp whistle violently shattered the heavy, freezing silence of the dark woods. Before Garrick could grip the leather reins, a massive, thick iron net erupted from the deep snow, completely entangling his black warhorse. The panicked beast reared aggressively, screaming in sheer terror as it crashed heavily to the frozen ground, throwing the Alpha King into the deep, icy snowbank. Garrick roared with pure, raw physical fury, drawing his heavy steel broadsword as he scrambled aggressively to his feet. From the dense shadows, dozens of heavily armed mercenaries slowly emerged, entirely surrounding him with drawn, jagged blades and heavy steel crossbows. They were ruthless outlaws from the deeply corrupt southern borders, completely taking advantage of the sudden, terrifying collapse of the Royal Intelligence Network. In the glorious past, Briony whisperers would have easily intercepted this massive, deadly ambush, neutralizing the treacherous mercenaries with silent poison long before they could lay a single trap. But tonight, the great Alpha King was completely, utterly alone. Garrick fought with the terrifying, brutal ferocity of a completely desperate, cornered beast. His heavy broadsword cleaved violently through the freezing air, shattering the heavy iron weapons of the approaching mercenaries with devastating brute force. He moved with a breathtaking, deadly grace, entirely fueled by the fierce, agonizing demand of his severed mating bond. He violently, desperately needed to survive this chaotic, bloody skirmish to formally, deeply apologize to his brilliant He slammed his heavy armored shoulder directly into a massive mercenary, violently throwing the man against a thick frozen pine tree before disarming a second attacker with a brutal swift kick. The dark snowy clearing was quickly painted with crimson blood as Garrick completely unleashed his legendary unstoppable physical wrath upon the treacherous assassins. But raw, unyielding muscle has an absolute inevitable limit. As Garrick violently struck down the fifth heavily armed attacker, a sharp, agonizing, burning pain suddenly exploded in his left shoulder. A highly stealthy archer entirely hidden in the high dark branches had successfully fired a short heavy iron bolt directly into the unprotected joint of his heavy silver armor. Garrick stumbled heavily, his massive frame dropping violently to one knee as the dark blood rapidly soaked his thick white tunic beneath the cold metal. His heavy broadsword slipped from his numbing fingers, clattering loudly against the icy ground. He was the greatest undefeated alpha warrior in the entire realm, yet he was completely suddenly brought down by a single hidden coward in the absolute dark. The terrifying, staggering reality of his immense vulnerability violently crushed his remaining toxic pride. He completely finally understood the profound absolute truth that brute physical force was nothing but a fragile glass weapon without the brilliant calculating mind to properly direct it. The remaining heavily armed mercenaries aggressively closed the tight circle around the fallen crippled king, their cruel faces twisting into ugly victorious sneers. The lead assassin raised his jagged broadsword, preparing to violently sever the royal head and claim the massive corrupt bounty. Garrick looked up at the deadly falling blade entirely devoid of any terrified fear. He only felt a profound, devastating sorrow, wishing he had just one single final moment to look into Briony's striking amber eyes and formally beg for her brilliant, unmerited forgiveness. But as the heavy, jagged blade descended, a sudden, incredibly sharp, whistling sound sliced cleanly through the freezing dark air. A perfectly aimed small silver throwing knife, exactly like the one that had flawlessly saved him on the hunting path, suddenly buried itself deeply into the lead assassin's thick throat. The massive mercenary violently dropped his heavy sword, clutching his bleeding neck as he collapsed heavily into the deep red snow. The entire deadly clearing instantly froze in absolute sheer terror. From the absolute pitch-black shadows of the towering ancient trees, a dozen silent figures seamlessly emerged, surrounding the panicked remaining mercenaries. They wore sleek, dark velvet cloaks, wielding small, deadly poison weapons with a breathtaking, terrifying, calm precision. They were absolutely not clumsy royal guards. They were the highly elite, lethal whisperers of the Shadow Court. The remaining panicked mercenaries immediately violently dropped their heavy iron weapons, falling heavily to their trembling knees, entirely recognizing the terrifying, undeniable, absolute authority of the silent. Garrick clutched his bleeding shoulder, his massive chest heaving violently as he desperately stared into the absolute pitch-black tree line. The heavy, agonizing pain in his shoulder was entirely eclipsed by the fierce, explosive roaring of his rushing blood. His heart pounded a frantic, erratic rhythm directly against the heavy silver insignia hidden beneath his armor. The silent elite whisperers parted, creating a narrow, dark path through the frozen, snowy clearing. A massive, terrifying cliffhanger perfectly settled over the freezing, bloody woods as a single, small, cloaked figure gracefully stepped out from the absolute total darkness, revealing absolutely nothing but a pair of striking, incredibly fierce amber eyes, completely proving to the broken, bleeding king that he was no longer the supreme ruler of this domain, but a completely vulnerable, desperate prisoner walking directly into the magnificent underground kingdom she flawlessly ruled. The heavy black cloth was pulled swiftly from King Garrick's eyes, revealing a breathtaking, sprawling subterranean city hidden miles beneath the frozen northern mountains. The great alpha warrior stood completely mesmerized, entirely forgetting the agonizing pain in his bleeding shoulder. The cavernous space was brilliantly illuminated by thousands of flickering blue and golden lanterns, casting a magnificent warm glow over a highly organized, buzzing empire of pure intelligence. The sheer, staggering scale of the hidden operation violently shattered the last fragments of his toxic, arrogant pride. Hundreds of silent scholars, agile whisperers, and elite shadow operatives moved flawlessly across the carved stone floor. Massive, complex maps of the known world were meticulously spread across heavy oak tables, covered in shifting wooden markers tracking every single military movement and secret aristocratic whisper in the realm. This was absolutely not a desperate rebel. It was the pulsing, terrifying heart of a sovereign shadow kingdom, and he had just been escorted into the absolute center of its raw, magnificent power. Garrick, icy blue eyes, frantically scanned the bustling underground court, desperately searching for the woman he had completely broken. The silent elite whisperers respectfully parted, clearing a wide path toward a raised obsidian platform. At the very end of the massive cavern, resting atop the highly polished black stone, was an intricately carved high-backed chair completely surrounded by towering stacks of highly encrypted scrolls and complex brass decoding instruments. Sitting flawlessly in the magnificent throne was Briony. Garrick's massive chest violently heaved, his breath catching in his dry throat as he stared up at her in absolute overwhelming awe. She looked absolutely nothing like the pathetic, trembling servant girl he had cruelly publicly discarded in the glittering Great Hall. She wore sleek, dark leather armor perfectly tailored to her incredibly strong frame, draped entirely in a rich midnight velvet cloak that cascaded gracefully over the dark stone steps. Her long dark hair was no longer messily hidden beneath a plain, coarse, itchy shawl, but hung freely over her shoulders, framing a face of absolute terrifying cold authority. She did not lower her striking amber eyes when the massive Alpha King slowly approached the base of the grand platform. Instead, she locked her fierce, predatory gaze directly onto his, completely freezing his rushing blood with a chilling, undeniable sovereign dominance. The profound, breathtaking transformation was absolutely staggering to his arrogance. He finally truly saw the magnificent, terrifying mastermind she had always been. Every single cruel moment of their miserable marriage violently flashed through his completely shattered mind. He vividly remembered her sitting silently in the drafty corners doing her chaotic, messy embroidery while the arrogant, noble ladies cruelly laughed at her domestic failures. He suddenly realized with a horrifying, crushing clarity that her needlework was a flawless coded map, tracking their secret treasons while protecting his oblivious life. Her supposed boring dullness was an absolute masterpiece of psychological camouflage, a brilliant, perfect disguise that successfully fooled the greatest military minds in the entire world. Garrick slowly walked toward the heavy obsidian platform, his heavy armored boots echoing loudly against the polished stone floor. He felt incredibly, utterly small, entirely stripped of his heavy golden crown and his massive iron broadswords. He was completely at her absolute mercy, surrounded by hundreds of lethal assassins who fiercely worshipped her intellect. He stopped at the very base of the dark steps, his bleeding shoulder throbbing painfully, but he refused to show any physical weakness. He looked up into her striking amber eyes, his deep, raspy voice carrying an incredibly heavy, emotional weight that completely silenced the massive, bustling cavern. He softly whispered her name, his dark soul completely breaking open as he desperately tried to find a single tiny trace of the quiet, gentle Omega wife he had completely thrown away. But Briony's face remained an impenetrable, flawless mask of absolute clinical detachment, entirely devoid of any warm affection or trembling, submissive fear. She slowly stood up from the heavy obsidian chair, her sleek velvet cloak moving with a terrifying, deadly grace. "You're completely out of your element, King of the Spears," she stated coldly, her incredibly smooth voice echoing with absolute, undeniable sovereign authority that easily dwarfed his massive alpha roar. "You loudly, publicly declared that I was a boring, unobservant creature completely unfit to stand in your magnificent, powerful shadow. Yet here you are, bleeding pathetically in my deep, hidden domain, entirely dependent on my elite shadows to save your heavy, arrogant neck from a handful of uncoordinated border mercenaries." Her sharp, ruthless words sliced flawlessly through his massive chest, cutting infinitely deeper than the heavy poison arrow currently buried in his shoulder. She completely, systematically dismantled his entire military legacy with a few brilliant, sharp sentences, completely proving that his massive physical strength was absolutely nothing without her flawless guiding intelligence. Garrick's massive jaw violently clenched, swallowing the bitter, agonizing taste of his profound, monumental failure. He completely, deeply understood that she absolutely deserved to violently, verbally destroy him in front of her entire shadow court. He slowly reached beneath his thick, bloody tunic, his violently trembling fingers, carefully pulling out the heavy, intricate silver insignia of the Shadow Wolf. He held the sacred crest out toward her, his icy blue eyes burning with a desperate, agonizing sincerity. "I was a completely blind, arrogant fool. Briony," he whispered fiercely, his deep voice heavily laced with absolute, devastating regret. "I built a massive fortress of heavy stone, but I completely allowed a terrible, toxic rot to violently fester inside its walls. I foolishly, brutally threw away the most magnificent, brilliant mind in the world because I was too incredibly stupid to recognize the blazing fire burning right beside me." Briony stared down at the heavy silver crest resting in his large, bloody, calloused hand, her striking amber eyes completely unreadable and fiercely unyielding. She did not immediately rush forward to accept his desperate, broken apology or to gently comfort his bleeding physical wound. She had spent her entire miserable life brutally suppressing her magnificent genius to survive in his toxic, arrogant world, and she would absolutely never return to the dark, suffocating shadows of his old, brutal. She slowly, confidently walked down the highly polished obsidian steps, stopping just inches away from his massive, heaving chest. The physical proximity was incredibly suffocating, the heavy, intoxicating scent of her wild lavender mixing violently with the sharp, metallic tang of his fresh blood. A massive, terrifying cliffhanger violently gripped the tense underground air as she coldly informed him that his desperate, poetic apologies meant absolutely nothing, because the incredibly powerful High Council he had blindly trusted had just successfully initiated a massive, bloody coup, and if he truly wanted to reclaim his violently collapsing kingdom, he would have to completely unconditionally surrender his entire sovereign absolute authority directly to her brilliant mind right now. The heavy synchronized footsteps of the corrupt guards echoed loudly directly against the thin stone wall, entirely trapping Briony and Garrick in the freezing narrow passage. Garrick immediately violently gripped the heavy hilt of his dark broadsword, his massive muscles completely tensing as he prepared to aggressively smash through the hidden door and slaughter the treacherous patrol. He wanted to violently protect her using the only brutal language his old world understood. But Briony quickly reached out her small hand, gently pressing her fingers directly against his massive armored chest, entirely halting his violent instinct. She did not panic or tremble. Her brilliant analytical mind instantly accessed her flawless eidetic memory, retrieving the exact highly classified patrol schedules she had secretly memorized months ago. She looked up into his intense icy blue eyes, her striking face completely calm, and she softly whispered that they absolutely must not fight, because true power was knowing exactly when to stand perfectly still. She explained that the corrupt captain of this specific guard detail was a heavily indebted drunkard who always paused exactly at this hidden alcove to secretly consume a hidden flask of cheap ale before quickly moving toward the warm kitchens. She silently counted down from 10, her sharp amber eyes locked onto the heavy stone door. Exactly as she flawlessly predicted, the loud, heavy footsteps suddenly paused. A faint metallic clinking sound echoed through the stone, and then the guards aggressively marched away, completely abandoning their post. Garrick slowly released his heavy grip on his broadsword, staring down at her with absolute, profound, staggering awe, entirely realizing that her terrifying, flawless intelligence was infinitely more deadly than his heavy steel. Briony gently pushed the hidden stone door open, leading the massive Alpha King directly out of the dark, freezing servant passages and into the blinding, chaotic light of the Grand Palace. They pulled their heavy, dark velvet cloaks tightly around their shoulders, adjusting their beautifully, intricately carved silver masks as they flawlessly blended directly into the massive, swirling crowd of the masquerade ball. The grand central ballroom was an absolute, magnificent, breathtaking spectacle of extreme aristocratic vanity, completely reeking of profound moral decay. Thousands of thick beeswax candles burned brightly in the massive crystal chandeliers, casting a warm golden light over the swirling sea of heavy silk, rich velvet, and glittering stolen diamonds. The corrupt high nobles laughed loudly and danced wildly, entirely celebrating their supposed bloody victory over the Alpha King, while the starving innocent commoners suffered terribly right outside the high stone wall. Garrick felt a sudden violent roaring surge of pure alpha fury, violently burning in his massive chest as he watched the treacherous lords openly drinking from his royal wine cellars. He wanted to violently tear off his silver mask and brutally execute every single traitor in the Grand Room to completely avenge the massive disrespect they had shown his kingdom. But Briony remained perfectly, completely calm, her sharp amber eyes acting as a highly lethal, flawless weapon as she systematically began to read the massive chaotic. She smoothly guided Garrick through the swirling dancers, her small hand resting gently on his massive muscular forearm, completely using his terrifying, imposing physical presence to easily part the dense aristocratic crowd. She did not need to hear their highly encrypted hushed whispers to completely understand their dark secrets. She read the subtle, complex physical gestures, entirely interpreting the undeniable hidden truth of their profound treason. She pointed out a wealthy northern count nervously tapping his heavy gold ring against his crystal wine glass, perfectly identifying him as the corrupt financier supplying the hidden mercenary armies. She smoothly, completely analyzed a group of whispering southern duchesses, recognizing the specific aggressive tilt of their heavily powdered heads, entirely proving they were secretly smuggling highly lethal poisons into the royal kitchens. Every single subtle movement, every nervous darting glance, every forced arrogant smile was an incredibly brilliant, complex puzzle that her magnificent, terrifying mind flawlessly, instantly decoded, displaying her absolute mastery over the entire corrupt court. Garrick walked silently directly beside her, acting as her absolute, fierce, impenetrable shield, completely mesmerized by her breathtaking sovereign power. He realized that she was not merely observing the Grand Room, she was completely, undeniably dominating it from the absolute shadows. She was the brilliant master spider, perfectly sitting at the very center of a massive, highly toxic web, pulling invisible strings and watching the arrogant flies completely tangle themselves in their own dark treason. After an agonizing, tense hour of perfectly maneuvering through the chaotic dancing crowd, Briony suddenly violently stopped, her sharp amber eyes completely locking onto a seemingly harmless figure sitting quietly in the dark, opulent corner of the Grand Room. It was the elderly Duke of the Treasury, a frail old man who had always pretended to be completely, utterly loyal to the royal crown, entirely acting as a weak, pathetic advisor, completely devoid of any dangerous ambition. Briony looked up at Garrick, her smooth voice incredibly low and vibrating with absolute, undeniable, chilling certainty. She completely revealed the horrifying massive truth, declaring that the frail elderly duke was not a weak, pathetic servant, but the ultimate absolute terrifying mastermind behind the entire bloody kingdom-wide conspiracy. She brilliantly explained that the duke had been secretly systematically embezzling massive amounts of royal gold for decades, deliberately slowly starving the outer provinces to intentionally completely collapse the royal infrastructure and violently seize absolute power. He had brilliantly used the arrogant younger lords as loud, chaotic distractions, completely keeping the Alpha King utterly blind to the true silent rotting disease, violently destroying the massive empire from the inside out. Garrick's massive chest heaved with pure violent shock, his icy blue eyes completely narrowing with devastating raw lethal intent as he stared at the frail, treacherous old man, completely realizing how profoundly he had been manipulated by the very men he trusted. He prepared to violently draw his heavy, dark broadsword, entirely completely ready to physically execute the ultimate mastermind right in the middle of the glittering dancing crowd. But a sudden, massive, terrifying cliffhanger violently, completely gripped the tense, chaotic air as the frail, elderly duke suddenly slowly turned his head, his cold, dead eyes completely locking directly onto Briony's silver mask from across the massive, crowded ballroom. The ultimate mastermind slowly raised a heavy crystal wine glass, completely signaling to a dozen heavily armed hidden assassins disguised as ordinary noble dancers who instantly aggressively began to close in around Briony and Garrick, completely trapping the brilliant Shadow Queen and her devoted Alpha King in the very center of the massive, glittering, inescapable, deadly web. The heavy, glittering crystal chandeliers above seemed to violently tremble as the dozen hidden assassins rapidly closed the tight circle around Briony and Garrick. The massive grand ballroom, which moments ago was a chaotic, swirling sea of aristocratic vanity, instantly transformed into a terrifying, deadly arena. The frail elderly Duke of the Treasury stood perfectly still in the dark, opulent corner, his cold, dead eyes completely devoid of any remaining false loyalty. He simply raised his crystal wine glass a fraction of an inch higher, and the heavily armed assassins completely dropped their pathetic, noble disguises. They aggressively drew long, jagged, poisoned blades from beneath their heavy silk coats, moving with a terrifying, coordinated, lethal precision that proved they were highly trained southern mercenaries specifically hired for this exact bloody execution. The arrogant, corrupt lords and the terrified southern duchesses immediately began to scream wildly, violently, pushing against each other in a massive, frantic stampede to escape the center of the room, entirely abandoning the Alpha King they had falsely sworn. Garrick felt an absolutely explosive, roaring surge of pure legendary alpha fury violently detonate within his massive chest. He did not hesitate for a single microsecond, completely throwing off his heavy dark velvet cloak and his beautifully carved silver mask. He stepped violently, aggressively in front of Briony, entirely transforming his massive muscular frame into an absolute, impenetrable physical wall of raw, lethal intent. He drew his heavy, dark broadsword, the massive steel blade ringing loudly, sharply against the chaotic screams of the panicked crowd. His icy blue eyes darkened into a terrifying, stormy gray, completely prepared to violently, brutally slaughter every single mercenary who dared to take a step toward his magnificent queen. He was the greatest undefeated physical warrior in the history of the Northern Empire, entirely ready to unleash a catastrophic, bloody massacre right on the polished marble floor to fiercely protect the brilliant woman he loved. But Briony's brilliant analytical mind operated vastly faster than his raw physical wrath. She instantly, systematically analyzed the massive, chaotic room, completely realizing that a brutal physical confrontation here would absolutely result in the horrific, senseless slaughter of the innocent servants and musicians trapped along the outer walls. She also flawlessly recognized that the dozen visible mercenaries were merely the first deadly wave, and the heavy iron doors of the ballroom were currently being violently breached by 50 more heavily armed corrupt guards. She quickly reached out, grabbing Garrick's massive muscular forearm, her small fingers digging fiercely into his warm skin. She did not scream in terrifying fear. She issued a sharp, absolute tactical command. She ordered him to completely fall back, immediately guiding him forcefully toward the massive, heavy oak doors leading directly into the adjacent Grand Royal Library. Garrick's raw instincts screamed at him to aggressively hold his ground and violently fight, but his deep, profound submission to her unparalleled intellect completely overrode his alpha pride. He trusted her brilliant mind infinitely more than his heavy steel. He swung his massive broadsword in a terrifying, wide, deadly arc, forcing the front line of the poisoned mercenaries to violently stumble backward, and then he immediately followed Briony's swift, elegant retreat. They moved with breathtaking, flawless synchronization, completely bursting through the heavy oak doors of the Grand Library just as a deadly volley of heavy iron crossbow bolts violently shattered the space where they had been standing. The heavy oak doors slammed shut violently behind them, and a terrifying, loud, mechanical grinding noise echoed through the thick wood as heavy iron barricades were aggressively dropped into place from the outside. They were entirely locked inside the massive cavernous royal library. The grand room was a magnificent, sprawling sanctuary of ancient knowledge, with towering wooden bookshelves reaching directly toward the high vaulted ceiling. But the beautiful sanctuary was rapidly transforming into a terrifying, inescapable death. Outside the heavy barricaded doors, the frail elderly Duke's cold voice echoed loudly, ordering his corrupt soldiers to completely burn the library to the ground, entirely erasing the Alpha King and his shadow mastermind from the absolute history of the Empire. Within terrifying, agonizing seconds, the massive high stained glass windows of the library were violently shattered from the outer courtyard. Dozens of heavy glass vials filled with highly volatile black burning oil were aggressively thrown directly into the room, immediately followed by blazing wooden torches. The extremely dry ancient parchment and the towering heavy wooden bookshelves instantly erupted into a massive, terrifying inferno. The heat was incredibly suffocating, rapidly filling the cavernous room with thick, blinding, toxic smoke. The roaring, chaotic flames aggressively climbed the ancient walls, completely surrounding Briony and Garrick in a devastating, inescapable circle of absolute pure destruction. Garrick's massive chest heaved violently, his icy blue eyes completely reflecting the terrifying, roaring orange flames. He knew absolutely perfectly well that no man, no matter how incredibly physically strong, could ever fight a massive raging inferno or survive the heavy collapsed roof of a burning stone castle. He truly believed that this was the absolute brutal end of their magnificent journey. He slowly, aggressively tightened his massive grip on his heavy broadsword, preparing to violently smash his physical body against the barricaded oak doors, entirely ready to brutally die fighting to give Briony a single fragile second to escape. He looked down at the brilliant woman standing beside him, his heavily scarred face completely filled with a profound, devastating, heartbreaking sorrow, realizing he had finally found the absolute true love of his life, only to completely violently lose her to the tragic, blazing fires of his own past arrogance. But a massive, terrifying, beautiful cliffhanger violently gripped the heavy, suffocating, burning air as Garrick looked into Briony's striking, amber eyes. The magnificent sovereign of the shadows was entirely devoid of any terrified fear. She did not weep, and she did not aggressively, violently brace for death. She stood completely still. Amidst the roaring, chaotic inferno, her brilliant, calculating mind systematically, flawlessly tracing the complex, ancient architectural lines of the high vaulted ceiling, completely preparing to turn the absolute, terrifying, deadly trap into her ultimate, magnificent weapon. The roaring, chaotic flames aggressively climbed the towering wooden bookshelves, completely threatening to instantly incinerate the Grand Royal Library and everyone trapped inside. Garrick stood completely ready to violently throw his massive, muscular body against the heavy, barricaded oak doors, entirely prepared to brutally sacrifice his own life to give his magnificent queen a single fragile chance to escape the terrifying inferno. But Briony completely ignored his raw physical instinct for brute force. She gracefully reached out her small, calloused hand, gently grasping his massive, heavily scarred forearm and forcefully pulling him away from the burning wooden doors. She did not scream in terrifying fear, and she absolutely did not weep in desperate defeat. Her striking amber eyes rapidly scanned the high vaulted stone ceiling, completely penetrating the thick, blinding, toxic smoke. She was not merely looking at the beautiful ancient architecture, she was flawlessly accessing her unparalleled eidetic memory, entirely retrieving the massive, complex blueprints of the original fortress built centuries before the corrupt High Council ever existed. She smoothly explained her brilliant tactical realization, her incredibly calm voice easily slicing through the deafening roar of the... She told the completely stunned Alpha King that the Grand Royal Library was absolutely not just a magnificent room for storing ancient parchment, but was deliberately built directly beneath the primary gravity-fed, holding reservoirs of the massive ancient aqueduct system. The frail elderly Duke and his corrupt, treacherous lords had completely forgotten the profound hidden history of their own grand palace, entirely blinded by their shallow, toxic vanity. They foolishly believed they had flawlessly trapped the brilliant Shadow Master in an inescapable, deadly inferno, completely unaware that she had flawlessly memorized every single hidden water valve and structural vulnerability in the entire massive empire. She smoothly guided Garrick through the terrifying, roaring flames, completely avoiding the collapsing, burning wooden beams with a breathtaking, terrifying, flawless precision. They reached the absolute darkest back corner of the burning grand room, where a massive ancient stone pillar stood completely untouched by the aggressive flames. Attached to the heavy solid stone was a large, intricately carved iron sconce, completely appearing to be nothing more than a beautiful decorative holder for a massive beeswax candle. Briony did not hesitate for a single microsecond. She reached up with her small calloused hands, completely gripping the heavy iron fixture, and aggressively violently pulled it straight down with all her physical strength. A sudden incredibly loud mechanical grinding noise violently echoed through the thick burning walls, completely overpowering the deafening roar of the massive inferno. The ancient heavy iron gears hidden deep within the solid stone architecture groaned violently loudly as they were aggressively forced into sudden motion after centuries of complete silent dormancy. Garrick watched in absolute profound staggering awe, entirely mesmerized by her breathtaking flawless execution. Suddenly the high vaulted stone ceiling directly above them violently cracked open. A massive, terrifying, deafening roar echoed through the grand library, completely unlike anything the great Alpha Warrior had ever heard. It was not the loud, chaotic sound of heavy clashing steel or aggressive marching infantry. It was the absolute, unstoppable, devastating raw power of pressurized water. Millions of gallons of freezing cold water violently, aggressively burst through the massive, cracked ceiling, completely instantly flooding the grand cavernous room. The terrifying roaring orange inferno that had threatened to completely incinerate them was violently, brutally extinguished in a matter of breathless, chaotic seconds, entirely replaced by a massive, surging, violent tidal wave of absolute freezing salvation. Briony and Garrick were violently thrown against the heavy, solid stone walls, completely submerged in the chaotic, surging, freezing water. But Garrick quickly, aggressively wrapped his massive, muscular arms entirely around her small, delicate frame, acting as her absolute, impenetrable physical anchor. The sheer, terrifying, explosive velocity of the massive water completely blew the heavily barricaded oak doors violently off their heavy iron hinges. The massive heavy wave violently aggressively surged completely out of the grand library directly into the wide outer corridors. The 50 heavily armed, corrupt assassins who were confidently waiting outside to brutally execute any survivors were completely, instantly swept away by the devastating violent flood, entirely, completely neutralized, without Garrick ever having to swing his heavy, dark broadsword a single time. The brilliant Shadow Queen had flawlessly, brutally defeated a massive, highly trained military force, using absolutely nothing but her unparalleled intellect and the ancient stones of the castle. The massive, chaotic, rushing water finally began to violently recede, completely draining out through the lower shattered windows and leaving the Grand Royal Library entirely soaked, completely ruined, but absolutely permanently safe. Garrick stood slowly in the deep, freezing puddles, his heavy, thick armor completely drenched, and his massive chest heaving violently as he desperately gasped for the cold, clean air. He held Briony incredibly tightly against his wildly beating heart, completely refusing to let her fragile body slip away. They had flawlessly, miraculously survived the absolute deadliest trap the corrupt High Council could possibly engineer. The violent, immediate physical threat was entirely, completely neutralized, but a massive, profound, terrifying, beautiful cliffhanger violently gripped the freezing, damp air. As they stood entirely alone in the dark, ruined, magnificent library, completely soaked and shivering violently, the intense, explosive, raw adrenaline of their miraculous survival violently, aggressively crashed directly into their violently reawakened sacred mating bond, entirely pushing them toward an absolute, profound, breathtaking, romantic climax that could absolutely no longer be suppressed or ignored by either of their deeply, completely starving souls. The heavy, freezing water slowly drained from the massive ruined library, leaving behind a profound, deafening silence that completely replaced the terrifying, roaring inferno. Garrick and Briony stood entirely alone in the dark, cavernous room, their heavy, dark clothes completely soaked and clinging tightly to their violently shivering bodies. The grand, beautiful sanctuary of ancient knowledge was entirely destroyed, but the absolute, brilliant masterpiece of her mind had miraculously saved their lives. Garrick slowly, gently released his massive protective grip on her small, delicate frame, stepping back just enough to look directly down into her striking amber eyes. The warm golden light of the massive chandeliers was completely gone, replaced entirely by the cold, pale moonlight, perfectly filtering through the violently shattered stained glass windows. The pale silver light beautifully illuminated the incredibly heavy, exhausted rise and fall of her chest, and the completely undeniable, magnificent, fierce strength radiating from her entire being. He was completely, absolutely mesmerized, entirely captivated by the profound, breathtaking reality that this quiet, brilliant Omega had completely, flawlessly conquered the absolute deadliest trap the entire corrupt High Council could possibly engineer. The massive, explosive, raw adrenaline from their terrifying, miraculous survival was rapidly, violently transforming into a completely different kind of overwhelming, intense energy. The deeply severed sacred mating bond that Garrick had brutally, arrogantly rejected in the glittering great hall suddenly violently roared to life within his rushing blood, entirely screaming with a fierce, agonizing, undeniable demand. It was no longer a forced, toxic obligation completely dictated by archaic royal traditions. It was an absolute, magnificent, profound, soul-deep connection, perfectly forged in the terrifying, blazing fires of absolute mutual survival. He felt an incredibly heavy, painful ache violently gripping his massive heart, a profound, devastating realization of exactly how incredibly close he had just come to permanently losing the absolute, true, magnificent love of his entire life. He slowly reached out his massive, trembling, calloused hand, entirely ignoring the freezing cold air, and gently, incredibly tenderly cupped her wet, soft cheek. Briony breath hit sharply in her throat, her striking amber eyes completely widening as she felt the intense, overwhelming, radiating heat of his large, rough hand against her freezing skin. For her entire miserable, traumatic existence, she had been violently forced to completely hide her brilliant, terrifying fire, deeply terrified that the arrogant alpha world would violently, brutally But as she looked up into Garrick's intense, burning, icy blue eyes, she saw absolutely no terrifying threat and no toxic, dominating arrogance. She saw a completely broken, deeply humbled Alpha King entirely willingly bearing his massive, heavy soul, completely surrendering his incredible, legendary, raw physical strength directly to her unparalleled, brilliant intellect. The massive invisible shield she had carefully, painstakingly built around her own fragile, beating heart slowly began to completely, violently crumble. The fierce, profound, intoxicating, romantic tension that had been beautifully, slowly building between them completely, irrevocably shattered the last remaining heavy barriers of her traumatic, dark past. Garrick slowly leaned his massive, heavily scarred face down, his deep, raspy voice, an incredibly low, vibrating, intimate whisper that completely filled the silent, dark, ruined library. He fiercely, softly told her that he was an absolute, completely blind fool for ever believing that a heavy golden crown or a heavy steel broadsword was the ultimate true measure of sovereign power. He profoundly, deeply confessed that her brilliant, magnificent mind was the absolute greatest unstoppable weapon the massive Northern Empire had ever seen, and her quiet, fierce, resilient heart was the absolute only true sanctuary his dark, violent soul would ever need. He entirely, unconditionally pledged his royal life, his massive, heavy sword, and his eternal, unwavering devotion directly to her, completely promising to violently, brutally destroy the old, corrupt world and flawlessly rebuild a magnificent new empire, completely, perfectly balanced upon her brilliant, unmatched genius. Briony felt a massive, overwhelming, beautiful surge of absolute, pure, profound emotion violently erupt in her chest, completely stealing the cold breath from her lungs. The fated mating bond violently, aggressively snapped completely back into perfect place, entirely sending a magnificent, breathtaking, rushing electric shock straight through their completely intertwined souls. She slowly, confidently reached up her small, callous fingers, gently, completely tracing the heavy, rough scars on his massive jawline, entirely accepting his profound, absolute submission. She did not need to speak a single word to completely convey her profound, undeniable acceptance. She slowly leaned entirely forward, and Garrick immediately aggressively closed the remaining physical distance, completely pulling her tightly against his massive, broad chest and capturing her soft lips in an incredibly fierce, desperate, breathtaking kiss. The absolute, profound, romantic kiss was completely, entirely devoid of any toxic, conquering dominance. It was an absolute, magnificent, equal merging of pure, raw physical strength and unparalleled, brilliant intellect. It tasted of freezing rain, dark smoke, and absolute, undeniable, triumphant survival. Garrick's massive, muscular arms wrapped fiercely, protectively around her small, delicate waist, entirely anchoring her completely to his violently beating heart, while Briony entirely surrendered to the intense, overwhelming, beautiful, intoxicating heat of his profound, eternal devotion. They stood completely, flawlessly locked together in the dark, freezing ruins of the ancient Grand Library, entirely finding absolute, perfect, brilliant warmth in each other. But a massive, terrifying, beautiful cliffhanger violently, completely gripped the cold, damp air as they slowly, finally pulled apart their completely intertwined souls, entirely, completely realizing that surviving the inferno was absolutely only the very first step, and tomorrow morning they would have to confidently march directly back into the massive, glittering Great Hall to completely, violently, publicly destroy the corrupt High Council and entirely, permanently rewrite the ancient, rigid laws of the absolute, entire, massive empire. The pale morning sun violently pierced through the high stained glass windows of the glittering Great Hall, casting long, colorful shadows across the palace. The massive grand room was completely filled with the arrogant, corrupt High Council and the treacherous southern nobles who were loudly celebrating their supposed absolute bloody victory. The frail, elderly Duke of the Treasury stood proudly directly in front of the empty, heavy iron throne, wearing a massive, incredibly thick gold chain that completely symbolized his newly stolen supreme authority. He loudly, falsely proclaimed to the completely deceived royal court that the great Alpha King and his unknown shadow accomplice had tragically, violently perished in a massive accidental fire in the Grand Royal Library. He completely falsely declared a period of deep national mourning, while simultaneously aggressively moving to permanently, legally seize the absolute supreme power of the massive Northern Empire. The corrupt lords raised their heavy crystal wine glasses in a joyful, arrogant toast, completely believing they had flawlessly, violently eradicated the only two people who could ever possibly stop their massive toxic greed. But the arrogant, joyful toast was absolutely violently interrupted by a sudden, terrifying, deafening crash. The massive, heavy iron doors of the Great Hall were violently, aggressively kicked completely open, shattering the heavy wooden barricades and sending a massive, terrifying echo bouncing off the high stone walls. The entire glittering, aristocratic crowd instantly froze in absolute sheer terror, their heavy crystal glasses slipping from their trembling fingers and shattering loudly against the pole. Standing flawlessly directly in the massive open doorway, perfectly framed by the blinding morning light, was Alpha King Garrick and the brilliant Shadow Queen Briony. They were absolutely not dead, and they were completely, undeniably terrifying. Garrick's massive muscular frame was completely radiating an explosive, roaring, pure alpha fury, his heavy dark broadsword drawn and resting perfectly across his broad shoulders, but it was Briony who absolutely, completely commanded the massive, terrified room. She was absolutely no longer the pathetic, worthless servant girl in a plain gray dress. She wore her sleek dark leather shadow armor and a rich midnight velvet cloak, her striking amber eyes burning with an absolute, undeniable, terrifying sovereign dominance. The frail elderly duke completely violently paled, his frail hands shaking aggressively as he desperately, frantically ordered the remaining royal guards to immediately violently arrest the king and the shadow spy, claiming they were dangerous, bloody imposters. But absolutely not a single heavy armored guard dared to take a step forward, entirely, completely paralyzed by the legendary, terrifying physical presence of their true, undefeated Alpha King and the absolute, chilling sovereign authority radiating from the brilliant Omega standing directly beside him. Garrick did not violently, aggressively charge into the massive crowd to brutally slaughter the treacherous lords. He stepped slightly back, entirely, completely surrendering the absolute center stage directly to his magnificent queen, completely allowing her brilliant mind to flawlessly, legally execute the corrupt, aristocratic parasites. Briony stepped confidently, smoothly forward, her small calloused boots clicking sharply, loudly against the polished marble floor, completely demanding the absolute, undivided attention of the entire massive court. She did not raise her smooth voice to a frantic, desperate scream. She spoke with a perfectly calm, incredibly chilling, absolute authority that effortlessly sliced entirely through the heavy, terrified silence. She raised her small, delicate hand, and suddenly dozens of silent elite shadow whisperers completely seamlessly emerged from the dark, hidden alcoves of the Great Hall, entirely surrounding the massive, trapped, aristocratic crowd. They carried massive, heavy wooden crates entirely filled with thousands of highly encrypted raven scrolls, hidden financial ledgers, and completely undeniable physical proof of the massive kingdom-wide conspiracy. Briony flawlessly, systematically unleashed her absolute, brilliant masterpiece, entirely destroying the corrupt High Council socially and legally with her terrifying, unparalleled intellect. She began to flawlessly, publicly read from the meticulously gathered evidence, her brilliant mind perfectly matching every single secret treasonous document to the specific terrified lords standing in the room. She looked directly at the wealthy northern count and loudly, explicitly detailed the exact massive amount of royal gold he had secretly funneled to the violent border mercenaries, completely exposing his hidden illegal armories. She turned her striking amber eyes to the terrified southern duchesses and flawlessly, publicly revealed the exact highly lethal poisons they had smuggled into the royal kitchens, entirely destroying their pathetic, false, innocent facades. And finally, she confidently stepped directly up to the trembling, frail, elderly Duke of the Treasury, her smooth, chilling voice completely exposing his massive, decades-long financial embezzlement, entirely proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that he had deliberately starved the outer innocent provinces to violently fund his own pathetic, massive vanity. The incredibly massive, overwhelming weight of her undeniable, flawless evidence completely, violently shattered the fragile, toxic, aristocratic alliance. The terrified, corrupt lords immediately began to frantically, loudly turn against each other, violently, aggressively pointing fingers and desperately screaming pathetic, weak excuses in a desperate attempt to save their own heavy, arrogant necks. The loyal inner royal guards, who had been completely deceived by the High Council, suddenly violently realized the horrifying absolute truth. They immediately aggressively drew their heavy steel weapons, completely turning their deadly blades directly against the treacherous, corrupt nobles, entirely, completely, legally arresting the frail elderly duke and his massive toxic conspiracy. The great Alpha King had absolutely, completely regained his massive kingdom entirely, without violently spilling a single drop of innocent blood, all perfectly, flawlessly orchestrated by the brilliant, magnificent mind of the Omega he had once publicly discarded. The massive, chaotic Great Hall was completely, violently purged of its dark, rotting, toxic disease in a matter of breathless, triumphant minutes. The heavily armed guards aggressively dragged the screaming, terrified, corrupt lords down into the deep, freezing subterranean dungeons, completely permanently ending their pathetic, arrogant reign of terror. Garrick stood completely, proudly beside Briony, his icy blue eyes absolutely overflowing with endless, profound, staggering reverence for the magnificent, brilliant woman who had flawlessly saved his entire massive empire. The immediate physical and political threat was entirely completely neutralized, but a massive, beautiful, terrifying cliffhanger violently completely gripped the tense, victorious air as Briony looked up at the massive, empty, heavy iron throne, entirely realizing that simply punishing the corrupt High Council was absolutely not nearly enough, because to ensure this massive dark treason never ever happened again, they would have to completely, violently, permanently rewrite the ancient, rigid laws of the crown from the absolute ground up. The massive, heavy iron throne sat entirely empty at the very center of the glittering great hall, completely radiating the dark, toxic history of the old, archaic world. Briony stood perfectly still at the base of the grand marble steps, her striking amber eyes completely locked onto the imposing cold metal chair. For absolute centuries, that heavy iron structure had exclusively belonged to arrogant, violent alpha warriors who completely blindly worshipped raw physical muscle and brutally oppressed anyone who possessed a brilliant mind instead of a heavy broadsword. It was the absolute ultimate symbol of the terrifying rigid caste system that had violently murdered her magnificent father and cruelly forced her to hide her own breathtaking intellect in the dark, freezing shadows. She knew with absolute profound certainty that simply sitting on that heavy, cold iron would entirely, completely betray everything she had just fought so desperately to expose. Garrick stood directly beside her, his massive, muscular frame completely relaxed but entirely radiating an incredible, undeniable sovereign power. He did not aggressively rush up the marble steps to quickly reclaim his heavy golden crown. Instead, he slowly, gently reached out his massive, calloused hand entirely, completely, intertwining his thick, rough fingers with her small, delicate ones. He turned his heavily scarred face toward the remaining members of the royal court, the loyal outer guards, the diligent scholars, and the lower-ranking nobles, who had completely survived the massive political purge. His icy blue eyes were absolutely, entirely devoid of the toxic, arrogant pride that had once violently blinded his dark soul. He spoke with a deep, resonant, thunderous voice that effortlessly, completely filled the massive, cavernous room, carrying an absolute, profound, devastating sincerity that instantly demanded their complete, undivided attention. He loudly, publicly declared that the massive Northern Empire had blindly, foolishly worshipped the heavy steel sword for far too long, entirely, allowing a terrible dark rot to violently consume its foundation. He completely admitted his own profound, catastrophic failures, loudly confessing to the entire massive court that his legendary raw physical strength was absolutely nothing but a fragile, hollow shell, without the brilliant, flawless, tactical mind of the magnificent woman standing directly beside him. He completely, entirely shattered the ancient, rigid laws of the crown, loudly, fiercely proclaiming that the kingdom would absolutely no longer value brute physical dominance over breathtaking, profound intellect. He declared that Briony was absolutely not just his queen consort, but the true, absolute, supreme sovereign of the massive Northern Empire, the magnificent, brilliant shadow master who had flawlessly, silently kept them all alive. The massive royal court gasped in absolute, profound, staggering awe, entirely, completely mesmerized, as the great alpha warrior slowly, deliberately unbuckled his heavy, dark broadsword from his broad, muscular back. He did not hand the massive, heavy weapon to his royal guards. He slowly, respectfully laid the heavy, deadly steel directly at Briony's small, callous feet, completely, entirely surrendering his absolute physical military might to her superior, brilliant command. Then he slowly reached up and removed the heavy, ancient golden crown from his own head, the very symbol of his absolute, supreme alpha authority. He did not loudly demand that the high priest perform a sacred, complex ritual. He took the absolute, supreme authority upon himself, acting as her fiercely devoted equal. Briony felt a massive, overwhelming, beautiful surge of pure, profound emotion completely erupt in her chest as she watched the most powerful man in the known world willingly, absolutely surrender his entire massive empire directly to her brilliant. She did not shrink back or tremble in terrified, submissive fear. She slowly, gracefully stepped entirely forward, completely stepping out of the dark, freezing shadows of her traumatic past and stepping directly into the bright, blinding, magnificent light of her true, absolute destiny. She looked out at the massive, silent court, her striking amber eyes burning with an incredibly fierce, undeniable sovereign fire, completely proving that she was absolutely ready to flawlessly carry the immense heavy weight of the entire world. Garrick slowly, gently lowered the heavy, ancient golden crown, placing it perfectly carefully upon her dark hair. But as the cold, heavy metal touched her brow, Briony smoothly, confidently reached up her small, delicate hands and completely, entirely removed the heavy golden crown. The massive court gasped in absolute sheer terror, completely fearing she was violently rejecting the Alpha King again. But Briony simply looked up into Garrick's intense, burning, icy blue eyes, her smooth, chilling voice echoing with a profound, absolute, brilliant authority. She clearly, fiercely declared that she would absolutely accept the heavy, immense responsibility of the massive kingdom, but she would absolutely not wear the cold, dead gold forged by the corrupt vanity of the old toxic world. She commanded that the heavy ancient crown be completely entirely melted down and reforged into a sleek, elegant silver circlet, resembling the shadow wolf, completely symbolizing that true absolute power did not shout loudly from a heavy throne, but watched brilliantly flawlessly from the quiet shadows. Garrick's massive chest heaved with a sudden profound surge of fierce absolute pride, his magnificent queen completely entirely rewriting the ancient archaic rules on her own brilliant magnificent terms. He slowly deeply bowed to her, completely formally recognizing her as the absolute supreme ruler. The massive chaotic great hall erupted into a deafening roaring cheer of absolute pure jubilation, the loyal guards and scholars dropping heavily to their knees in profound staggering reverence. They completely worshipped the magnificent, brilliant mind that had flawlessly saved them from absolute bloody ruin. Briony stood proudly, powerfully at the center of the cheering court, completely entirely victorious. But a massive, terrifying, beautiful cliffhanger violently, completely gripped the tense, victorious air as the heavy iron doors of the great hall suddenly opened again, entirely revealing the massive, towering figures of the arrogant outer border generals who had just arrived from the distant western front, completely entirely unaware of the massive political revolution and absolutely entirely unwilling to ever physically submit to the tactical commands of a completely brilliant Omega. The heavy iron doors of the great hall remained violently, completely open as the massive, arrogant generals from the distant western front aggressively marched into the grand room, entirely, completely expecting to find the old toxic world perfectly intact. They wore heavily dented steel armor and thick bearskin cloaks, their massive heavy boots, stomping loudly, aggressively against the polished marble floor, completely entirely ignorant to the profound, breathtaking revolution that had just violently swept through the capital. The lead general, a massive hulking alpha warrior covered in thick, brutal battle scars, completely sneered down at the completely shattered remnants of the old High Council, entirely, completely refusing to acknowledge the magnificent, brilliant Omega standing powerfully directly beside his Alpha King. He loudly, arrogantly demanded to know why the royal vanguard was not aggressively preparing for a massive, brutal spring offensive, completely entirely expecting Garrick to violently nod in absolute blind agreement. But Garrick remained perfectly, completely still, his massive muscular arms crossed over his broad chest, his icy blue eyes entirely, completely locked onto Briony, entirely deferring the absolute supreme authority. Briony stepped confidently, smoothly forward, her striking amber eyes completely locking onto the massive, arrogant general with an absolute, undeniable, chilling sovereign authority. She did not raise her smooth voice, and she absolutely did not order Garrick to violently, aggressively draw his heavy, dark broadsword to brutally force their blind physical submission. She completely, flawlessly utilized her absolute, unparalleled, brilliant intellect, turning directly toward her silent elite whisperers, who immediately, completely, seamlessly brought forth a massive, heavy stack of high border reports. She flawlessly, systematically dismantled the arrogant general's entire massive military career, completely, entirely, publicly exposing his tragic, devastating tactical failures. She calmly, loudly detailed exactly how his blind reliance on brute physical force had violently, unnecessarily slaughtered thousands of innocent royal soldiers in the western gorges, completely proving that his massive, heavy broadsword was an absolute, devastating liability to the entire northern empire. The massive, hulking general completely, violently paled his heavy, toxic alpha pride entirely, completely shattering under the massive, overwhelming, undeniable weight of her brilliant, flawless tactical analysis. She did not violently execute him. She completely, entirely stripped him of his heavy golden military rank, permanently banishing him and his arrogant commanders back to the freezing outer villages, entirely replacing them with sharp, brilliant scholars and highly agile elite spies from the deep, subterranean shadow court. The entire massive kingdom watched in absolute, profound, staggering awe as the great Alpha King and the brilliant Shadow Queen completely, entirely, flawlessly dismantled the toxic, archaic hierarchy of the massive old world. They worked completely, perfectly, seamlessly, side by side, their profoundly, deeply intertwined souls entirely, completely radiating an absolute, unstoppable sovereign power. The grand, heavy oak tables of the royal war rooms were completely, entirely cleared of the old rusty iron broadswords, entirely replaced by massive, complex geographical maps and incredibly intricate financial ledgers. The massive sprawling Northern Empire was absolutely no longer governed by the loud, chaotic, violent whims of arrogant alpha warriors. It was flawlessly, completely guided by the absolute magnificent calculating brilliance of the Shadow Network. Briony completely entirely dedicated her new absolute supreme authority to fundamentally violently rewriting the ancient rigid laws that had brutally murdered her magnificent father. She legally officially completely abolished the toxic oppressive caste system, entirely decreeing that absolute profound intellect and fierce resilient tactical brilliance would forever completely outrank heavy physical muscle. She ordered the immediate massive construction of grand magnificent academies, entirely completely designed to properly educate and intensely train the completely overlooked Omega population. She entirely completely ensured that the quiet brilliant minds who had been violently forced to hide in the dark drafty corners for absolute centuries were flawlessly systematically elevated directly into massive positions of critical strategic power within the royal court. The massive Because of military command and the vast intelligence network she watched completely filled with a massive, overwhelming, beautiful, profound emotional pride, as young, fragile Omegas confidently, proudly walked through the Grand Palace corridors, their brilliant, recognized and fiercely protected by the heavy steel of the new Royal Guard. Garrick completely entirely supported her magnificent, brilliant vision, his massive physical strength acting as the absolute impenetrable fierce shield surrounding her magnificent revolutionary mind. He completely flawlessly retrained the entire massive royal army, completely entirely teaching the young arrogant alpha recruits to profoundly, deeply respect the quiet tactical scholars and to blindly, flawlessly follow the brilliant strategic commands of the Omega commanders. Their beautiful, profound, deeply romantic connection completely entirely flourished in the bright, magnificent sunlight, absolutely completely free from the toxic, suffocating dark shadows of their miserable past. He constantly, deeply, respectfully sought her brilliant, flawless counsel, his absolute eternal devotion entirely completely evident in every single deeply affectionate glance and every fiercely protective gentle touch. They were the absolute perfect flawless embodiment of true magnificent equal power, a breathtaking devastatingly powerful union of massive raw physical might and absolutely unparalleled brilliant intellect entirely healing the deep devastating brutal wounds of the entire massive kingdom. The massive Northern Empire rapidly, violently transformed into a breathtaking, thriving, impenetrable sanctuary of deep, profound knowledge and absolute, undeniable, peaceful prosperity, entirely, completely guarded by the terrifying, invisible, lethal shadows of her loyal whisperers. Briony stood flawlessly, gracefully on the high grand balcony overlooking the massive, bustling, magnificent capital city, her striking amber eyes absolutely burning with a fierce, beautiful, triumphant fire. She had completely, entirely, flawlessly avenged her brilliant murdered father, not by spilling massive rivers of toxic dark blood, but by completely, entirely, beautifully building a magnificent new world where his kind could completely, flawlessly, proudly thrive in the bright, warm light. But a massive, terrifying, beautiful, profound cliffhanger violently, completely gripped the warm, gentle spring breeze as she slowly, softly placed her small, calloused hands directly over her lower stomach, completely, entirely, profoundly realizing that her magnificent revolutionary legacy was absolutely no longer just a massive, brilliant political idea, but a completely undeniable, rapidly growing, beautiful physical reality entirely. Completely preparing to introduce a completely new, magnificent heir to the beautifully transformed Grand Empire. The Grand Northern Empire had finally blossomed into a magnificent, impenetrable fortress of knowledge and absolute peace. Years had passed since the brutal fall of the corrupt High Council, and the massive halls of the royal palace no longer echoed with the hollow sounds of hollow, arrogant pride. Instead, the corridors were alive with the sharp intellectual debates of scholars, the rapid scratching of quills, and the vibrant laughter of children, playing in the sun-drenched courtyards. Briony stood gracefully upon the high palace balcony, her striking amber eyes overlooking the thriving capital city that she had flawlessly rebuilt from the absolute ashes of the old toxic world. The massive empire was no longer governed by the loud, violent whims of archaic alpha war. It was a thriving masterpiece of strategic brilliance where every single citizen, from the lowest servant to the highest noble, was valued entirely for their magnificent, unique intellect and their unwavering dedication to the collective good. Beside her, King Garrick stood with a profound sense of quiet, absolute contentment, his massive muscular frame no longer coiled in the constant tense expectation of a brutal battlefield. He wore no heavy silver armor today, but simple, comfortable velvet robes that perfectly complemented his magnificent sovereign presence. His icy blue eyes were entirely fixed upon the small, delicate form of his brilliant queen as she gently rested her hands upon her slightly rounded stomach. The magnificent revolutionary legacy they had flawlessly built together was now physically growing within her, promising a bright future for the Empire. Garrick reached out his large calloused hand, gently covering hers, his touch radiating an intense, fierce, eternal devotion that had only deepened with every passing beautiful day. He had completely surrendered his massive ego to her brilliant mind years ago, and he had never once regretted the absolute profound choice that had saved his kingdom and his dark, lonely soul. In the vast sunlit courtyards below the Grand Academy of Intelligence, hummed with an incredible energy. Hundreds of students of all castes, including many incredibly talented Omegas, were intensely studying complex ciphers, geopolitical strategy, and the ancient history of their newly formed union. This grand institution was the magnificent heartbeat of the empire, a place where the quiet, brilliant minds that had once been violently hidden in the dark were now flawlessly celebrated as the ultimate supreme protectors of the realm. Briony and Garrick oversaw this grand academy with a shared, fierce commitment, ensuring that the horrific mistakes of the past would never, ever be repeated. They were not just rulers, they were the architects of a magnificent, permanent enlightenment, ensuring that their children and their children's children would inherit a world built on profound mutual respect and breathtaking intellectual freedom. The couple walked slowly together toward the Grand Royal Gardens, where their young daughter was currently practicing her tactical maneuvers with a wooden training blade under the watchful eye of a highly skilled Omega mentor. The sight of their child confidently, skillfully navigating the complex training exercises filled Briony with a massive, overwhelming surge of pure, profound joy. She had successfully completely broken the suffocating chains of her traumatic past, ensuring that her daughter would never have to be invisible or fear her own magnificent blazing fire. The kingdom was safe, the councils were wise, and the people lived in a newfound beautiful harmony that had once seemed completely, utterly impossible. The Shadow Network still silently, flawlessly guarded the borders, ensuring that no external threat could ever again disturb the perfect peace they had so meticulously, brilliantly cultivated. As the sun began to slowly set behind the towering northern mountains, casting a breathtaking golden glow over the flourishing empire, Briony felt the absolute, complete fulfillment of her lifelong struggle. She was no longer the discarded, boring servant girl. She was the brilliant, magnificent architect of a new world, the sovereign Shadow Queen, who had rewritten the absolute destiny of an entire massive civilization. She looked up at Garrick, his face glowing with a tender, absolute love that transcended all power and status. They had truly forged a bond that was entirely indestructible, a perfect union of raw strength and brilliant mind that would stand as an eternal example for all future generations of the Northern Realm. The legacy they had created was not just one of political success, but of profound human healing and the absolute triumph of light over the crushing, suffocating darkness. Their journey had been incredibly long and filled with agonizing tests of faith. But standing there in the beautiful quiet of their magnificent sovereign home, Briony realized that every single painful moment of her struggle had been absolutely worth it. She had found her voice, her purpose, and her true, undeniable equal. The kingdom was safe, the future was bright, and their magnificent family was finally whole. She leaned her head gently against Garrick's broad shoulder, completely content in the knowledge that they had successfully, permanently changed the world for the better. The shadows were no longer a place of hiding, they were the beautiful protective canvas upon which they had painted their magnificent, brilliant masterpiece of peace and progress. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering story. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you. Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction, created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, settings, and events depicted are entirely imaginary and are not intended to represent real-life people or situations. Please view for entertainment purposes only.